Hi, this is Paul, and I've started going through 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote for Chaos. And I've started on the audiobook, and what I often do with these books is I'll go through the audiobook, and as I go through the audiobook, I'll highlight places because Kindle syncs it nicely, and then sometimes I'll go back and read things. And I did the little video yesterday, the little joke about the lobsters gossiping. But a number of things hit me right away in the lobster chapter in the book, which I really enjoyed. Now, a lot of this stuff is the same stuff that you've heard in Maps of Meaning, but as one of the points I've been making over and over again are these different ways of communicating, these different mediums, and how they shape how they shape the message. And so it's been really fun actually listening to Peterson. Peterson does the voice in the audio book, the audible version of the book, and so it's been fun listening to him as a reader instead of more extemporaneous speaker. That's been kind of fun. But the lobster chapter really caught my attention. And here he's writing about lobsters, and again, this I think is part of the more linear form a book takes rather than, let's say, spoken word. In the aftermath of a losing battle, regardless of how aggressively a lobster has behaved, it becomes unwilling to fight further, even against another previously defeated opponent. A vanquished competitor loses confidence, sometimes for days. Sometimes the defeat can have even more severe consequences. If a dominant lobster is badly defeated, its brain basically dissolves. Then it grows a new subordinate's brain, one more appropriate to its new lowly position. Its original brain, just isn't sophisticated. Its original brain just isn't sophisticated to manage the transformation from king to bottom dog without virtually complete disillusion and regrowth. Anyone who has experienced a painful transformation after a serious defeat in romance or career may feel some sense of kinship with the once successful crustacean. And again, I thought the entire lobster chapter was really good, and it was fun to hear Peterson kind of in this more linear format as an author. And what really struck me in that was the story of Christ and of Jesus and his crucifixion, because we would imagine that Jesus, like the crustacean, would dissolve and have a smaller brain, or his disciples would be crushed, because during Jesus' crucifixion, the disciples, they hide in despair, and only the women and young John, who at that point might just have been a teenager and therefore would not have caught the attention of those who killed Jesus. They were the only ones who dared to show at the crucifixion. And one of the themes that you get in the Bible is that it's the women again and again who stand by Jesus, and it's the women who show up at the tomb to do the dirty work, and it's the women who dare to go to the cross, and it's the women who supported Jesus in his ministry. Now, the crucifixion was an act of political drama to remind everyone that Rome was on top, and the sign that Pilate posts over the objection of those who brought Jesus to Pilate to crucify him, King of the Jews, in 3 languages, which was just complete irony. It was a clear message to the Jewish people at the time that Rome is your king. And in the Gospel of John, quite famously, the crowd cries out, "We have no king but Caesar." And this has been a bone of contention in the Gospels for years. But what struck me about the lobster piece in Peterson was how the gospel story takes this paradigm and flips it on its head. And one of the things I am terrifically indebted to Jordan Peterson for so much that I've learned so far from him. And I think part of the reason that I was so, like so many of you, I was so immediately hooked on his videos I was just learning so much. And some of the stuff from his, as a practicing, as a clinical psychologist, don't create safe spaces because there are no safe spaces. And in fact, safe spaces just make people weaker. You make people more courageous to face an unsafe world. And I thought that was exactly right. But it has to be voluntary, and this gets into Jesus. There's this funny thing in the gospel in terms of in what way is Jesus volitionally involved in his own execution? And the gospels very clearly show that this is a deliberate thing he's heading towards, but it's, right on that line. And then, how Peterson always talks about chaos and order. And so for Jesus, the crucifixion is right on this line where on one hand, he tells his disciples, I'm going to Jerusalem, and I'm going to be turned over into the hands of men. And then he's tried by Pilate, and anybody, all the gospel accounts are pretty clear that that Pilate understood that this was a political hit job, and Pilate understood that this man didn't do anything worthy of a capital crime, and that there were other motivations involved in terms of bringing Jesus in for crucifixion. But what happens is that Jesus doesn't plead his own case. And obviously the very famous story in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will but yours be done. And so you get the sense that, it has to be voluntary. And Jesus' crucifixion, he has to go to the cross willingly, but yet this is an atrocity and an outrage against justice. And I mean, all of those paradigms come together. And one of the things that the reason I first started watching Jordan Peterson, I'd heard about the pronoun thing, and I thought, isn't this, this wonder, like this burning bush, and I thought, isn't this funny? This lecture in psychology in the University of Toronto won't use they instead of she and her, and I thought, my goodness, that's quite something. And then I saw this video of him at the McMaster University, and I saw everyone just heaping insults on him, and I saw him, keeping his act together and not getting simply vindictive against his enemies, but trying to make a rational case for the points he was trying to make. And so, this is something that I've learned from Peterson with respect to hardship, that, he always talks about the predatory mechanism and the prey mechanism. And obviously with his future authoring program, he uses some of the prey mechanism. You have to write out what you fear, and you have to, in a sense, run from it. But this idea that you really have to turn from prey to predator, because once you get your will involved and once it becomes volitional, it changes what it does. Now, I'm going to be a little autobiographical in this, because this made me think of my father, and next month is the 5th anniversary of my father's death. My father was a minister like I am, and a lot of people recognize that I look like him. If you want to know his story, he basically wrote an autobiography for the family, in which he kept all of these stories of ministry from Peterson, New Jersey, where he ministered for a very long time. And he, sometimes people will ask me, a number of people in the comment section have asked me, what are some books that you recommend? Well, probably one of the most formative books in my life was the book of my father, not actually the literal book he wrote, but the book that was his life. And because he was, raised by my grandfather, and I'll talk about him in a few minutes, on the prairies during the Depression, and then, probably the only black folks he ever saw were porters on the trains that they would take from these no place prairie places to Grand Rapids, where my grandparents were from. And then after seminary, he goes and works in Peterson, New Jersey, and that little business down there. I'll put a link to the eulogy that I gave him in the memorial service that we held in Peterson. His funeral was in Whitensville, Massachusetts, and then we had a memorial service in Peterson a few months later. But Peterson, New Jersey in the 1960s, Peterson, New Jersey has always been a place where it's, people are going to hate me for saying this, but Peterson has always been a shithole. And when we visited Peterson, not all of Peterson is a shithole, but when we visited Peterson in 2013 with my family, my kids had never been to Peterson. And I remember my son, we're driving through Peterson, and my son looks around and he's like, "You grew up here?" When I visited New York City in 2006, I was just amazed at how clean the city was. And I had grown up in the 60s and 70s outside of New York, and this was Abe Beam and New York going bankrupt and all of this kind of stuff. And New York had this amazing transportation and the transformation in the 2000s, and is this glamorous, wonderful place that people love to go. In Times Square, they turned from, the peep show palaces into, kind of a Walt Disney. But Paterson hasn't had any such transformation. And Paterson has been a place where immigrants have come, wave after wave of immigrants. That's how, the Dutch who got there, and the Italians and the Irish, and then, between the wars, the great migration of African Americans, moves up into Paterson, and the Dutch community, the Dutch CRC community that was there, a few of those people said, it's our Christian duty to do what we can to help these people. And they started a little gospel sandwich mission, which was the kind of thing you started in the 40s and 50s, where it's like, well, I'll give you this bread, but you got to sit and listen to this sermon. And they called my father to try and take this little mission and turn it into a church, because they knew it was unsustainable. And that's exactly what my father did. And so he came there, and there were always a few, this is Angie Vogel, there were always a few brave souls who had a heart for these children in this community that were desperately poor and living in the workers' housing in Paterson. And so that's where my father came, and he didn't know anything about African Americans or the black community, but he spent 36 years there living and serving, and starting addicts rehabilitation programs. And he lived his life. And if you go on my Facebook, if you're my Facebook friend, and if you friend me on Facebook, I'll probably say yes if I look at your page and see that you're not a bot. But my father, there's tons of stories where my father just spent his life pouring himself out in Paterson. And if anybody needed to be moved, there were many times as a teenager, when I was old enough to be helpful, that I'd go with him with the church van and help move somebody or move a stove, or and he would visit people in the rottenest places in Paterson, and he would sit and talk with drug users and people whose lives were absolutely coming apart. And that's how he spent his life. And as a kid, you just grow up in it, you just watch him, it's just normal for you when you see it. And so this was my childhood, and this was the life I lived. And this is an Easter Sunday, probably in the mid 70s. At some point, Easter was always a big day in Paterson, and all these folks who were raised in church from the South would come to church on Easter in their best clothes. And there's David Apple. He works in 10th Presbyterian in Pennsylvania right now. And this was how I grew up. This was Northside, and it was as a kid, you don't know any different, but it was this, looking back on it now, it was this beautiful place where all kinds of people came together, and it was an alternative church for the black folks, and it was an alternative church for the white folks, and people who would never be friends. One of the families here is was the president of Holland American Lines, and there were always a few people who had wealth that kept the place going, and but it was just this beautiful place where people could come together and serve each other. And so my father spent his years, pouring himself out for the people of Paterson. But where did this come from? Well, his father, that's Hiram, the one in the tie. He'd seem to wear a tie every day because his wife liked it. His grandma's sitting right next to him, and my dad is next to my grandma, and my Aunt Glenda is over way on I guess it'd be the right, or the left, and my Uncle Dave is way over on the right. My Uncle Dave became a cop and on Long Island, and for years was a cop. And then when he retired, he went down to Florida, and he's a bicycle gang preacher now. And my grandmother hated beards. My poor grandma, we all grew them. But so this is where my father grew up, and my grandfather took this call to Canada, to Owen Sound, Ontario, and he didn't want to go there, and that call cost him tremendously. And my aunt, the young girl who's sitting there, had to go there when she was 13 years old, and the school system was horrible, and everybody picked on Americans, and it was a horrible thing. And so I told this story. I told this story at her funeral, which was just not very long ago, and I'll put the link to that in the comments here too, in YouTube. But she cried every night because she was so angry at them. And my grandfather, had to explain to her that, look, we did not want to come here. But what was happening at that point in Owen Sound, Ontario, was that the Dutch and the Frisians were, after World War II, there wasn't a lot of food in Europe. Eisenhower was really worried about how to keep Europe fed after the war, because Europe was so destroyed in the Second World War. And so these Dutch and these Frisians were coming to places like Ontario, Canada, and California, and they had nothing. And they were, now we look back on it, they were traumatized by the war. They couldn't get along with each other. They could be petty, they could be vicious. And my grandfather felt the need to go to Canada, and so he left his son, my father, in Iowa, where his previous church was, and that was one of his longest charges, where he would meet people, who pick up people from the train who were coming in, and these people were traumatized by the war, and they had lost everything, and they were coming into a place like Canada, and often people would come in and they'd have it was kind of like indentured servitude, 1950s style, where they'd have a contract with someone, they'd work for someone, and not all the farmers who would bring them over would treat them fairly. But these Dutchmen came, and my grandfather was the Dutch preacher, and he had to pick people up and get them settled. And so he poured his life out for these refugees coming from the Netherlands. And so, when I came of age, I, in many ways, just did what my father did. And my wife very much wanted to be a missionary, because her parents were missionaries in Africa. And so as it turned out, I became a missionary in the Dominican Republic, and I worked with Haitians. And, I think back on it now, and I was, they were so gracious to me. I was just a young kid. What the heck did I know? And here I am trying to be helpful. And, you're learning Spanish, and you're crucifying the language. But I learned way more from them than I'm sure they ever learned from me. And, I raise I start having kids. And so this is my oldest son when he was just a little fella. And this is where we grew up, and the people that, he started his life amongst. And then I come to Sacramento, California, and this just beautiful, crazy church takes me in. And, and I've pastored here for 20 years now, and the community keeps changing, and the church keeps changing, but in some ways it's not unlike my father's church. And the irony is that I never wanted to be a pastor, because I looked like my father, I walked like my father, I sounded like my father, and people would call me Little Rev. And so I decided I never wanted to be a preacher, but then I went to seminary, and because, I liked theology, and then my wife wanted to do mission work, and then we left the mission field, and we came, and, I wound up doing work that's a lot like my father. And sometimes my mother will laugh, because, the people I work with here in Sacramento, this is Daniel, again, someone who, homeless man, incredible problems, mental illness, substance abuse. He's in jail right now, and he's probably going to be in prison for a while. But for about 5 years, I couldn't get him, does not live against the door of my office. And I'd come to my office, and he would completely trash. He would turn the walkway out to my office into a shithole. And, he was raised a Mormon, and he was a tortured soul, because how are you a Mormon and an alcoholic? And so, this is the life he led. But again, in many ways, I learned more from him than I'm sure I ever taught him or did for him. And so this to me, gets into when I was listening to Peterson and the serotonin, But before we get that, tonight we have our little Bucko meetup here in Sacramento, and I'm asking people to come and share their favorite clips. And one of the clips I want to share is towards the end of the transliminal video when Peterson is talking about hell, because I really connected with that, because you know, most of my life I've lived in places that people with better opportunities flee. My father, raised us in Peterson, and my grandfather willingly went to Owen Sound to meet those refugees. And I live in an area of Sacramento that people from the nicer areas are sometimes like, we don't, I'm nervous about going down there, and I frankly think it's a little silly. But this is, in my opinion, this is what Christians do. The Christian story is a story of a God who, under no compulsion, sees the misery that his creation has brought upon himself, descends into it, and becomes subject to their misery. I mean, on one hand, it's the great hero story. And as Peterson says, I think he's exactly right. It's the archetypal hero story, and Jesus is this archetypal hero, and that's true. And as C.S. Lewis, I'm just about ready to start the C.S. Lewis series. I know some of you are waiting for it. As C.S. Lewis says, this is the true myth. This isn't Osiris that. This isn't some god that lived at some uncertain time. This is a man who comes and is born in 4 to 6 BC and is crucified somewhere around 30 AD. And in my opinion, there's sufficient historical evidence to believe that all of this really happened. And so Peterson talks about hell, and these are the places that I've lived, and these are the people that I work with. And as a pastor, just like as a therapist, you regularly visit people in their hells, and you hear their stories of pain. And there's no one of my big complaints about life in America is that America wants to say things like, well, if you can dream it, you can have it. And most of the people I look at, it just simply isn't true. And then when I lived overseas, one of the things that really crushed me emotionally in terms of working with the Haitians was, I come in there as a kid and I think, with all of our smarts and all of our money, and I have a, denomination backing me and a mission agency that we can really help these people. And you begin to learn just how complicated our brokenness is, that, all of the money and all of the power and all of the smarts and all the medical technology and all the psychology, and I have that all the time here now too. Many of the people I work with are, struggle with mental illness or struggle with things in their life. And here in this area of Sacramento, there's a lot of group homes, and a lot of people just have no chance. And so when I read Peterson's portions about the serotonin levels, and he goes into more detail, maybe I just don't remember it from his classes, but he goes into a lot of detail in the book. This is also true of low-ranking human beings, and those low levels decrease more with each defeat. Low serotonin means decreased confidence. Low serotonin means more response to stress and costlier physical preparedness for emergency. As anything whatsoever may happen at any time at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, and rarely something good. Low serotonin means less happiness, more pain and anxiety, more illness, and a shorter lifespan among humans, just as among crustaceans. If you are a low status 10, by contrast, male or female, you have nowhere to live or nowhere good. Your food is terrible when you're not going hungry. You're in poor physical and mental condition. You are of minimal romantic interest to anyone unless they are as desperate as you are. You are more likely to fall ill, age rapidly, and die young, with few or any to mourn you. Even money itself may prove of little use. You won't know how to use it because it is difficult to use money properly, particularly if you are unfamiliar with it. Money will make you liable to dangerous temptations of drugs and alcohol, which have been more rewarding if you've been deprived of pleasure for a long period. Money will also make you a target for predators and psychopaths, and you thrive on exploiting those who list on the lower rungs of society. The bottom of the dominance hierarchy is a terrible, dangerous place to be. And I read this, I immediately thought of my friend Daniel, because reading this is exactly his life. And again, I know Peterson, did a lot of work with alcoholics, and this is exactly his story. And he's everything what he says about money and about pleasure and all of that is just true. and for the work that my father did in, the work I did in the Dominican Republic. And you talk about these people not immigrating. These people are heroes to me, because I'll tell you, these people have nothing and they overcome. And the same with many of the people that my father worked with in Peterson, and the trauma that I've seen in the black community, and the folks moving up from the South. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And these are the lobsters that have been defeated. And so I ask, how do you pour out your life? I was reading, here's the thing. Why do poor people go to church? I mean, these Haitians, they're illegal in the Dominican Republic. They live in banana leaf shacks. They can be jerked around by the government. They work for a pittance, and they go there because life there is better than in Haiti. These people are screwed. They have no passport that's going to let them into the U.S., and if they can come in somehow, they're going to try. Of course they're going to try. I would. My ancestors did. And so poor people go to church. Why do poor people go to church? Well, I really appreciated Harari's book, Sapiens. And one of the points that Harari makes is that, if you listen to Richard Dawkins and this piece that I did a few videos ago about Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris are talking, and Dawkins makes the point that, genetics evolve slowly. And then Harari talks about the cognitive revolution. And what that means is that we can't, our genetics don't evolve fast enough to give us so let's talk in Darwinian terms. Our genetics don't evolve fast enough to give us an advantage in the society. And so human beings in the cognitive revolution develop this whole new level, which is the story level. And how that plays out in my story for the places that, for these people, I mean, I was always amazed by Daniel, how he would come to my church, because my church is about the only church that anyone, would have him in. And he's in jail because he eventually attacked a man in my church, and an old man, and cut up his hand. Daniel was a dangerous man, and Daniel threatened my life on a nearly daily basis. But, I'm younger and healthier and larger. And so he never, decided to physically take me on when he was in one of those moods. But, this is life in the lobster world. And so why do people go to church, and what is the gospel for? And it's we're transcending this misery, and these people are screwed. I don't know a lot of the faces in this picture, but knowing the story, many of the little girls in this story would probably get pregnant before marriage and struggle to raise kids. And then many of them would have to raise their grandkids, because daughters would get lost in the drug world. Many of these sons would be incarcerated or get lost in the drug world, or die young. That was the story in Peterson. My father did funeral after funeral after funeral. Often the funeral directors would call him because, there's nobody to do these people's funerals. And when I visited Daniel in jail a few months ago, I was the only one who'd ever visited him. And, and he says to me, "You're my only friend," and I'm a shitty friend. Yeah, there are hells. But what is the gospel? And what do we do by this story world? We transcend the serotonin deficits that I'm going to use vulgar language, that the fucked of the world, it's their only chance. And there are millions and millions, maybe billions throughout history. I think about the people who were, buried in the Great Wall of China. These are workers, nameless. No one will ever remember their names. And this is the human story. And so you say, well, what should you do in a world like this? Well, on one hand, you think you should rise to the top and get everything you can and make your life great. And yeah, that's reasonable. I understand that. But what Christians say is something different. This is the Sermon on the Plain, which is Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. He went down with them and stood on a level place. A large crowd of his disciples was there, and a great number of people from all over Judea, from Jerusalem, and from the coastal regions around Tyre and Sidon, who had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. These are the little people of the world. They have no hope. They're going to die young. They're going to, everything Peterson says about him is true. Those troubled by impure spirits. Now, an impure spirit would be, it could be mental illness. It could be spirits. It could, whatever it was, but basically impure there essentially means that these are causes to keep people estranged from society. And so often people come and they knock on my door of my church, and they knock and say, oh, are you the pastor? Yeah, I'm the pastor, and I need money. And what goes through my head immediately was, you weren't hatched. Something in your life happened. And, if I run into trouble, if I have no place to stay, I can call my sister or my mother or how many friends in Sacramento and say, I need a place to stay. And they'll say, Paul, come in, please. I'll take you in. But by the time people get to my door on Florin Road, they have no one who will open the door for them. Probably because they've been lost in a bottle or lost to drugs, and they've burned through all of their relationship, and they're trying to survive, and now they come to my door and they have no other option but to talk to a total stranger to try and get $3 or $4, maybe for a beer, because they woke up sober. And this is this world. These are the people coming to Jesus. And all the people tried to touch him. One of the things, Daniel would camp right in front of my door, and I'd have to step over him. And often, if he was depending on where he was in his mood cycle, sometimes he'd just need a hug. These two strange men in their 50s, one hugging the other. And then when I visited him in prison, he's like, oh, I just want to come home. I said, Daniel, what do you mean home? Home by your office. He says, I sit there and I remember the times that you stepped over me. I said, of course I stepped over you. You slept right in front of my frickin' door. I couldn't get into my office without stepping over you. But that was the one form of meaningful human contact he would have, because a lot of the other stuff, whether they were what he'd call the crack whores or the drug dealers, or, it's a jungle out there and people just don't touch the civilians because they know the cops will come down on them. But it's a jungle between everyone at that level. So these are the people coming to Jesus. Looking at his disciples, he said, blessed are those who are poor. Are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, because great is your reward in heaven. For that is how their ancestors treated the prophets. And have a brain when you read this stuff. Jesus, what are you, nuts? What do you mean, blessed are the poor? One of my favorite movies is Leap of Faith, because Steve Martin is having this conversation with Jesus on the crucifix that he's been doctoring because he's a fraud preacher. And Steve Martin says to the crucifix, blessed are the meek. All the meek get in this world is the short end of the stick. Yeah, that's right. Jesus says, blessed are the poor. Why? Blessed are those whose have been crushed like a lobster, and their brain is remade, and their the serotonin keeps them down. But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when people speak well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets. 1 Corinthians, brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. And this is what happens in the gospel, that this story verse that changes, in a sense, our genetics sets us up into this trap of being on the bottom. And Jesus comes along and says, follow me, because I was at the top, and I'm going to the bottom for you. And in fact, I'm going to get to the bottom and you're going to kill me and push me down even lower. And because of that, I didn't put Philippians 2 in that, but I did it in a sermon a couple weeks ago. Because of that, the Father lifted me and made me to the highest place. This is the gospel. And this is why the poor and the wretched and the people who have no hope in this world come into church and listen to Jesus, because here is an archetypal hero who had everything and descends into chaos. And that chaos crushes him. And he rises from the grave. And I'm I did this big thing about literal. Well, I think when Jesus came out of the grave in history, his disciples saw his hand and they touched him and they felt the wounds. And I think it's amazing that the wounds remained, because these, sometimes women will be a little, embarrassed about stretch marks, and I don't often tell them this because they don't respond well, but I'll say, hey, those stretch marks are badges of courage. Those are your medals of honor, because at the risk of your life you gave birth to another human being. It's built right there into creation, and C.S. Lewis is going to go into this in his book Miracles. And so Paul says to the church at Corinth, which was a mess of a church, brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards, and the church is full of unwise people. Not many were influential. Not many of you were of noble birth. And again, in the ancient world, and with the exception of the American experiment, birth was everything. It determined your destiny, and it still does in many ways. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things and the things that are not, to nullify things that are, so that no one can boast before him. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. So it is with me, brothers and sisters. When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And you're like, well, what does that mean? And it means that what Christianity does is takes people who they've got no shot at anything in this world. And again, this is who my father ministered to. This is who my grandfather ministered to. This is who I minister to. And this, I think, is what Christians do. Because, hey, it's the age of decay, baby. Everything you build is going to come apart. You build a great business, someone will come along later and, pick it clean. It's what the teacher in the book of Ecclesiastes sees. This is life in this world. And so Jesus comes to the poor and the wretched and says, you can be sons of God, which in the ancient world meant you'd have the highest status. You're going to be top lobster. And I thought in many ways, I thought of this when I was making this video, how I should take a lobster. I have some lobster pictures, because when I go back to New England, we always eat lobsters, but take a lobster and stretch out its claws, because in some ways that's Jesus on the cross. That's what the story is. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness, with great trembling, with great fear and trembling. And Paul comes to Corinth after Paul had a miserable life, and people, sometimes people are like, well, Jesus has a wonderful plan for your life, and I read in the Bible, and I think, well, it didn't work out so well for Paul. He was Saul, who became Saul's his Hebrew name, Paul is his Greek name. He was a successful Pharisee and had a great education, had a promising career as a Jewish as a Jewish Pharisee and a teacher of the law, and then he throws it all away because he has this vision on the road to Damascus. And if you read the rest of his life, everywhere he goes, he causes a riot, and he's stoned, and he's shipwrecked, and thing after thing after thing. And you get to read a book like 2 Timothy, and the guy seems depressed. And he says, I've only got one friend left. And you would think he would turn around and say, well, gosh, Meeting Jesus was the worst thing that ever happened to me, but he never says that. He always talks about it being the best thing that ever happened to him. So I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. And, people might ask how you become a Christian, and it's God does this. I'm a Calvinist. God invades us with his Spirit, and he brings us to places we don't want to go, and he puts us around people that no sane person would want to be around, and we decide we want to pour out our lives for these people. Does Jesus make you courageous and vital? Yes. But his way offers you serotonin in the midst of misery, and that's just it. And you have to ask, well, what option do the fucked of the world have? No, they don't have a lot. And Jesus comes and says, the greatest among you is the servant of all. Well, shoot, if you're already the servant of all, how can that change you? There's no physical way for so many people to be saved. And here's the irony, that for so many people who are screwed, it's the self-screwed nature of it that really brings them down. And why is it that in many places of the world, when the poor meet Jesus, they start saving money, they start taking care of their kids better, they start speaking the truth, because this is what their Lord wants them. And not everyone, and not perfect, and Christians and pastors are liars, and that's all true, and the church is full of hypocrisy and failed people and all kinds of misery. I mean, you won't get an argument from me on that. So Jesus makes us courageous and vital. Jesus allows me to have serotonin when the defeated lobster says I can't. And it offers you a hero story, even if you are a hero that nobody knows about. Sermon on the Mount, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues or on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And to me, this only makes sense with the resurrection. And I've used this little GIF for, the incarnation, for the Logos, where the Word becomes flesh. Well, in resurrection, the amazing story of Jesus, where the poor and the mistreated and the screwed of the world have hope, becomes flesh in the resurrected body of Jesus, where he shows up in a locked room and he eats a fish and they touch his flesh. And all of the gospel accounts, if you listen to N.T. Wright on the resurrection stories, what's amazing about all of the gospel accounts of the resurrection is that none of them sit down to try and get the story straight. It's all over the freaking map. Why? Because nobody knew how to talk about this thing. Is this Jesus? Is this not Jesus? What's going on? But people begin to believe it. And, keyholes become exclamation points, become changes in the physical world. Truly I tell you, Jesus replied, no one who has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me and the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age. Homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, fields, children and fields, along with persecutions. And again, I'll tell you, I wouldn't be so interested in Peterson if he wasn't persecuted. Because the truth is, if you're going to do anything in this world that's meaningful, there's going to be opposition. And in the age to come, eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. And so then, I know there's a lot of atheists and skeptics and even watching this, and what if I'm wrong? I could be wrong. The resurrection stories, people look at that and say, gosh, how can you believe that? that he would come back to life. And how could you believe what Paul says, that if we are in our baptism, we are crucified with him, and in his resurrection, we are raised with him. And Paul keeps saying again, we are in Christ. Well, what if I'm wrong? What if the resurrection didn't happen? What if my family is a bunch of idiots for spending their lives on people who are just plain screwed? What if this is all just a fantasy? And you know, my answer to that is, how else do you want to live your life? You know, it's short. You know, maybe it's, so many people are born, you know, so many people are born screwed. It's short. How are you going to spend it? Yeah, you know, dealing with people like, you know, dealing with people like Daniel, not fun. Not fun at all. And you know, yeah, chimps with snakes, and I can go through as pastor, you know, I know the ups and downs, the turmoils, the sins, the struggles that these folks have. This is what pastors do. We, you know, we pour out our lives, and you say, well, why would you do this? And I look back and I say, yeah, you know, things are hard, but I'd rather spend it no other way. And one of the things that always struck me, you know, my pastor kind of died with his boots on. He had a heart attack when he was sitting across the table at a coffee shop meeting with a guy who, you know, just needed someone to listen and someone to talk to. This is what pastors do. And I remember in my father's later years, I would ask him, Dad, do you get tired of it? Because I know a lot of pastors, they get into their 50s and 60s and they're just done. You know, they're just worn out, and they don't want to do it anymore. They don't want to listen to people. They don't want to clean up. They don't want to clean up the shit after people. They don't want to deal with people's shitty lives. And so they check out. And I asked my father, I said, Dad, how do you feel about this? He says, I've never loved it more. Now, you know, if you go to clinical pastoral education, you can look at that and say, oh, he's got a Messiah complex. And yeah, there were issues with that. But he didn't find any better way than to pour his life out for people who have no hope. And, you know, I agree with him. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm nuts. Maybe I should, you know, and I'm not going to make it sound like, you know, my church is wonderfully generous to me. I have a decent home. You know, I get paid regularly. You know, I have cars to drive. My kids go to college. I live a middle-class life. You know, that's part of what was so hard in the DR, that I had all this money and those people had nothing. And then you think, well, just give them your money. And then you realize, yeah, that doesn't work either. Our brokenness is way too complicated. So these are my thoughts as I listen to this chapter in Peterson. And, you know, forgive me the indulgence of being autobiographical, and forgive me the indulgence of just really being a preacher. But, you know, so why do I listen to Peterson? I get that question. You know, some pastors, or especially some Canadian pastors, or, you know, like, yeah, don't listen to Peterson. I mean, this guy's a huckster. And I think, no, I know hucksters. He could be duping me. I don't think so. I think he's the genuine article. And the reason I read these books, and the reason I do what I do and make these silly little videos is this, because I refuse to believe that the misery of this world will just end in a poof. And I, like Dostoevsky, believe that God will redeem this story. And in this story, you know, he'll make all sad things come untrue. And I believe that. And I don't think there's any better way to spend a life than to participate in that. That's why I'm a pastor. That's why I want to work with the people I work with. And that's why I do what I do. So, yeah, there's my story.